Hello everyone, my name is Zachary Stelter. I'm a professor of biology, and I wanted to make you aware of a research effort that has been underway this fall. Uh, Myself and 16 undergraduates have been investigating why some states saw an increase in their COVID-19 uh, incidence rates, while other states saw a decrease in their COVID-19 incidence, specifically from mid-November to mid-December. We looked at two different factors that might account for that variance. One, the level of stringency, how strict states' mitigation mandates were, and two, the level of prevalence in the state, so how many people had become immune to the virus, how much had the virus spread through the population. A little bit about how the study was done. Basically, there was a big spreadsheet that we worked to fill, and students were arranged in what we call matched pairs. So every state had two students recording incidence data for every day from November 12th all the way to December 8th. So they were collecting the data from each state. When specified, they were using confirmed and probable numbers, so those tests which were confirmed through PCR and antigen testing. And when it was specified, they were going off of the date that it was reported by the state, not the date that the symptoms arrived. There's a little variation there in how states reported those numbers. Each student would record their numbers, and then what I did is I cross-compared each of the data sets from each student, and as long as they were within a certain tolerance, we accepted those data. Anything that needed to be rectified was rectified and then included here in the master data set. All right. Also, what they did is they included the total number of reported cases in each state on November 12th, and then we adjusted that number to create a more accurate sense of the prevalence in the state. So our team of literature reviewers were combing through the data, and they saw that between March and July, the seroprevalence data suggested that there were 10 times more people that had encountered the virus than the reported numbers suggested. And then towards September, that number was closer to 8. So we went with a multiplier of 7. So we took the total number divided by the population, the total number divided or multiplied by 7 divided by the population to give our adjusted prevalence. The incidence numbers were then graphed. They were put on just basically graphed using Excel, and a trend line was applied. This is an exponential trend, and then we took the equation that was found from that plot, put it here, and then based upon the trend equation, we tried to figure out what the change in the incidence was. So, for example, once the trend was there, we took what the average incidence was at the end of our study, so on December 8th, subtracted from that the incidence at the beginning, divided it by the beginning to find the total change. Did the incidence increase or decrease throughout the timeline of the study? Okay, and that was the change in the incidence trends, this value here. Basically just taking the y-intercept times the exponential equation for 27 days, and then subtracting that from the initial divided by the initial. Okay, another part of this study was creating what we call a stringency score. So we looked at, had a team of students go through and look at all the different mitigation mandates that were being enforced in the states. Only the statewide executive orders were considered in this study, so some states have their own county or specific city-specific mandates. Those weren't involved in the scope of this study. And then any state that didn't specify specifically what the mandate was, we just included NA for those data fields. But we arranged all of these into different categories. So 10 categories. There was what states were doing for masks. That bared 17% of the weight of the total stringency score. There was the indoor gathering category. There was outdoor gathering category, weddings and funerals, religious or spiritual gatherings, K through 12 instruction, K through 12 extracurricular activities, large events and conferences such as college and professional sports, restaurants and bars, and then other public venues. So they went through, and then we had 3 scores that scored each of the states' mandates based upon how strict they thought they were. So states that were very strict received a higher score. States that were not as strict received a lower score. And then the composite score from all 10 of those categories was calculated here. So it took the average of score from each of the 3 scores for all the categories, calculated here. So the score would be between 0 and 100. Higher scores mean the stringency or the strictness of their mandates was more severe. Lower scores mean that the mandates were more lenient. Okay. There was a couple of discrepancies, so you'll note here on this Excel spreadsheet that there were some numbers here that are colored gold, and the issue there was if you plotted some of the data sets, there were places where there was no data recorded, so that there's a score of 0, and then we actually just put in 1 there because you can't, Excel doesn't allow you to graph a data set if there's zeros there, or it doesn't allow you to get a trend line on it. So we put a 1 in there instead, and you can see this is the same data set. The one on the top is graphed here, and you can see that this is the trend line that was applied. And if instead what you do is you take the value and you spread it out between the 3 days, or the 2 days or 4 days, however many days there's missing data, then it makes those data points fall much more in line with the entire incidence data set. So that was the approach that we used. I think it's a much more accurate way of figuring out the trends, and that is what we did on these numbers that are gold. Okay. Once we had all this data, the change in incidence, the adjusted prevalence, and also the stringency scores, we put it all together, and the plot looks something like this. So let me just walk you through some of the data that we found, or the results. Here we see all 50 states. This is the adjusted prevalence on November 12th, so basically what percentage of the population roughly had been infected in each of those states on November 12th, and then from there on, from November 12th to December 8th, what did they do? Did they see an increase in the COVID-19 cases, or did they see a decrease? And what we find is that there is like a transition threshold between about 19% and 33-ish%, basically meaning if the states were less than 19%, in other words, that the virus had spread through less than 19% of the population, those states were still subject to a very strong increase in the case incidence of COVID-19. So, for example, right here between about 10% and 19% is when states saw their biggest increase and had the strongest spike in COVID-19 cases. States that were between 19 and 33% when we had an adjusted prevalence were somewhat strong. There's a pretty substantial variance. You know, about half the states still saw an increase in their COVID-19 incidence. The other half of the states saw a decrease. And then once we get past about a 33% prevalence, all of those states saw a decrease from November 12th to December 8th. There was not one that had an increase. And then what we did is we labeled each of these with their stringency score that we calculated. So that's what this number is here in the parentheses. And then we took the average stringency score here of each one of these tiers, so each chunk of 50% incidence change. And what we see is that for the most part, as the states that saw the biggest decrease in their COVID-19 incidence trends from November 12th to December 8th, those were the states that had the lowest stringency score, so they had the least strict mandates. And then those states that had more strict mandates had the biggest increase, which we thought was a rational thought, right? Because the states that have the stricter mandates, the virus has spread through less of the population, so there's more people susceptible, and they're going to be more susceptible to a bigger spike in their incidence once the virus does start to make its way through the population. Those states that had the most lenient restrictions, they're states that had the virus spread through quite a bit more through the population, and so that population was more immune, and rather than increasing from November 12th to December 8th, they saw a decrease in their COVID-19 incidence trends. So that's the data. I hope that this presents a better picture of what's going on in the United States, specifically regarding this pandemic. And I just wanted to take a quick moment to acknowledge all the work that was done. These are all of the students who put in a lot of effort in a very tough time to invest hours researching. This was all happening during finals week, the end of the semester, so very grateful for all these undergraduates and the many hours that they put into this study. Thank you for your attention.